Hey everyone, today we're going to discuss how NAFTA, an international trading agreement, affects international logistics. This presentation was put together by Lancaster Richmond, Hannah Dole, Hugh Swart, and Hugo Garcia. What is NAFTA? North American Free Trade Agreement. This trade agreement was negotiated by President George H.W. Bush and then signed into law by Bill Clinton, in which it took full effect January 1st, 1994. Trade agreement that sets the rules of trade and investment between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. NAFTA has eliminated tariffs on most products traded between these three countries. These products include agricultural goods, automobiles, and textiles, among others. NAFTA was originally designed to unite the three countries' economies. With NAFTA, Mexico's standards of living would increase and create a valuable export market for U.S. and Canadian businesses. It is important to know that more than a third of U.S. exports flow into Canada and Mexico. What did NAFTA do? NAFTA allows for the decrease of trade barriers through the lowering of tariffs and duties. It provided uniformity for origin country provisions, which streamlined processes, along with the reduction of tariffs, allowed for decreased obstacles in moving a component or finished goods across borders. NAFTA eliminated custom charges. Mexico, Canada, and the United States did away with fees on goods originating in a NAFTA country and opened the Mexican border for U.S. trucks and streamlined border processing and licensing requirements.
On May 18, 2017, our trade representative Robert Lighthizer informed Congress that President Trump intended to renegotiate the terms of NAFTA. With the negotiation of NAFTA, the current administration would hope to support higher-paying jobs and growth in the United States, reduce the trade deficits with Mexico and Canada, and prevent other countries from manipulating currency to gain unfair advantages, and eliminate the Chapter 19 dispute settlement mechanism. To reduce trade deficits with NAFTA countries, the U.S. has two options: to increase exports or decrease imports. To increase exports, the United States would have to decrease trade restriction on exports and reduce duties and tariffs on exports. The way the U.S. would decrease imports would be by widening restrictions on imports and increasing duties and tariffs on imports. Having an unfair mechanism for currency exchange creates a way to manipulate currency and throw off currency exchanges. That could lead to one country having a competitive advantage over the other. The Chapter 19 dispute boils down to Canada wanting to resolve trade conflicts outside of U.S. courts. One could argue two sides: one, that U.S. courts have a lot of red tape and settling outside could resolve things much more quickly, or two, U.S. courts are very efficient and this would slow down decisions being made. If these provisions were implemented, it would affect international logistics in a number of ways. The main decision that will be made is, will it be cheaper to continue to trade within NAFTA, or will these new revisions force the U.S. firms to trade outside of NAFTA more often, with countries like China?
If firms choose to outsource to international markets outside of NAFTA, supply chains will lengthen and costs will obviously reflect this. To combat these increased costs, companies will want to ship larger volumes at once with fewer inventory shipments. The product's shelf life will therefore need to be longer to offset the longer lead times. Firms will also have to abide by less standard regulations, and the process will no longer be as streamlined as it was with the original NAFTA provisions. As mentioned previously, sourcing from farther international markets will lead to longer supply chains and increased cost structures. This includes higher tariffs and taxes, custom costs, less efficient supply chains, greater holding costs, and increased non-standard regulations. Higher costs will decrease profit margins, especially for smaller firms. Smaller companies lack the infrastructure to offset the costs of compliance and will therefore give larger companies an advantage due to their stronger staffing and analytic abilities. Supply chain structures will change as key trade players shift from inside to outside of NAFTA. American, Canadian, and Mexican governments and economies will be affected, as well as production facilities, transportation services, and consumers on a more micro level. More products could be produced within their own country to shield from extra costs of outsourcing, or trade will be conducted more frequently with countries outside of NAFTA. Trading outside of NAFTA will include increased rules, regulations, and costs. Manufacturers and suppliers will try to negate these risks and costs as much as possible, which increases the complexity of their supply chains.
When transporting across borders, scale requirements will rise to reduce the effect of the increased tariffs and regulation cost of moving components or finished goods to Mexico or Canada. Coordination will be affected by the revisions as well. Visibility could increase if they decided to source products within the United States, or if they decide to trade outside of NAFTA, visibility could be reduced. Visibility has the ability to decrease when you go global due to the unknown of planning for demand, forecasting, transportation costs, ability to sense and respond, and tracking inventory. The flow efficiency and ability to sense and respond could be decreased as well, as more trade barriers are introduced and supply chains are lengthened and made more rigid. If the NAFTA revisions were to go through, smaller firms may be put at risk. After revisions, products in the United States would be more expensive, forcing the smaller firms in other NAFTA countries to make a decision. They would either have to pay higher prices for U.S. products or resort to outsourcing in countries like China, where transportation, inventory, and holding costs would then increase. With these revisions, it is questionable whether or not some small firms will be able to survive these revisions. Quality of products could be increased if they are more locally sourced, as risk is reduced and oversight is expanded. However, they could be, on the other hand, compromised if firms trade outside of NAFTA because the ability to quality control would be decreased. Larger firms will be more resilient to the changes than smaller firms because they have the resources to make the necessary changes. For obvious reasons explained throughout the presentation, complexity of the firms will have to increase. Transaction costs will most likely increase no matter whether products are locally sourced or sourced outside of NAFTA, unless there are significant incentives created. After renegotiations, general trust between the countries would decrease as a result from the changes in trade, the U.S. being the odd man out. To review, renegotiations would make trade less appealing because more regulation ultimately means less efficient procedures, more import and export costs, and longer, more complex supply chains. These changes would most likely backfire and force firms to source outside of NAFTA instead of keeping trade within the United States.